Well, I've been looking forward to this all weekend. The captain sat down and had what I can only imagine to be a fascinating conversation with an author that I'm sure that some of you have heard of or may even own some of his books. I'm talking about William Ramsey. He is the author of Children of the Beast, Prophet of Evil, and the book that we recommended last week, Abomination. Whether or not you agree with him, his thoughts, theories, and books about Aleister Crowley and the West Memphis Three are certainly interesting and controversial. This week, the captain spoke with Ramsey about a true crime theory that is highly discussed. This is the Smiley Face Killer. The Smiley Face murder theory is a theory advanced by two New York City detectives that many young men found dead in the bodies of water across several Midwestern American states over the last decade did not accidentally drown, but were in fact victims of a serial killer or potentially multiple killers. As I said, I've been looking forward to this all weekend. Let's listen in together on a conversation with William Ramsey and the captain.
All right, William, first I want to thank you for joining us in the garage. I've been a fan of your work as far as 9/11, as far as Aleister Crowley, and as far as the West Memphis Three, which is a huge popular case and a case that is near and dear to mine and Nick's heart. And then all of a sudden, I see you do this Smiley Face Killer, and I'm interested on how you got into this theory of the Smiley Face Killer.
Well, that's a great question. I kind of followed this trajectory of the occult, and while I was researching my most recent book, which is called Children of the Beast, it's about Aleister Crowley's influence on the 20th century, I kept seeing the smiley face. And I had remembered this whole series of cases that was mentioned for the last maybe 15, 20 years publicly as the Smiley Face Killers. And that's really how I got my start. I probably started researching in early 2016, and the reason these series of cases of young men disappearing and then being found in water got the name Smiley Face Killers is because the original two or three, well, it's really three. It's Jeff Gannon, Duarte out of New York, and Gilbertson. They noticed that in some of these disappearances and the finding the bodies in water, there's been a smiley face. So it got the name the Smiley Face Killers, and this phenomenon started over 20 years ago. And so that's really how I got interested. When I started researching it in 2016, really the first case that I researched was a case that you guys on the garage followed, which was Joey LaBeaut. That was really the first case. And when he disappeared, I was following a researcher who's the main researcher on my film, Jim Smith. And when he disappeared, I said, if this guy gets found in water, I'm going to freak out. And he was found in water 19 days later in the, as you say, Scioto River, not the Scioto, spelled Scioto, but Scioto
River.
Scioto. Yeah. So, yeah, that was a tragic case, and that's really kind of how I got started researching the cases. So I wanted to kind of cover everything. So I actually, a couple of the true crime podcasts that you covered involved some of the cases that I also investigated as well.
Yeah, I'm not finished with the documentary yet, but you also did Joshua Guimond. And yeah, that's an interesting case as well.
Absolutely, Guimond. I think I don't know if I put Ross into the documentary, but I did some Illinois cases, and definitely Joey LaBeaut.
What's interesting to me is this is kind of loosely connected to the website, the Charlie Project. And I say loosely because that's just kind of a collection of missing men in college age, roughly, right?
Yeah, there's a few cases. There's another one, Footprints at the River's Edge, which covers these cases. And a lot of the cases show up on web sleuths. So there's just a lot of internet researchers posting information about these disappearances there as well, which I found to be invaluable for cases that had happened over 10 years ago.
You basically hone in on 30 cases?
I think so. I think I listed them out, but I really covered a lot of cases in the U.S. and the U.K. There were more cases that have happened. I did one in Thailand, France, and Spain, excuse me. But, Yeah, I would say the coverage of the cases is probably 40 or 45. I think as far as the cases that fit into this type of MO, this type of sequence of events where young men are out at night, disappear, they're searched intensely, and then found much later in water, I would say that there's conservatively about 150 of those cases, and possibly peaking at a very liberal, maybe 300 or 400 of these types of murders that have happened in the world over the last 25 years, 30 years.
Right. So there's hundreds, and what are you using to whittle that down? I mean, what are your? Did you have like a strict criteria, or was it a little loose?
Well, I tried to for the film that I made. All the cases that I included were younger people out at bars who were found in water, and there are other cases that may fit outside that. You and I had chatted about the Schaefer case that happened in Columbus, Ohio. Right. That was another one in a bar. He was never found, but that was a case that was really on the edge of whether I was going to put it in or not. I'd researched that as well, the Schaefer case, through True Crime for Irish, as a matter of fact. But so I think there are many cases that there are other researchers, interesting, who've looked into these cases. They've turned them something different. And I would actually argue or state that Smiley Face Killers is a kind of a misnomer. It just got that name because that's how people associated these similar types of cases throughout multi-state jurisdictions. But
right.
There's a guy in Manchester, his name's Gary J. He is working on a documentary right now called The Manchester Pusher about that story. And there's cases that are still happening in Manchester. There's also a girl in Boston. Her name was Elise Soper. I interviewed her, and she wrote about the Boston drownings on her excellent blog called Cryptid Antiquarian. And she's a great writer, but those cases that she posted about garnered her, I think it was something crazy. I think it was either 500,000 or 1 million people viewed it. She had like 200 or 300 comments on that blog. So people were reading that with great interest. So those Boston cases I included as well, Zach Marr, some of these other more recent cases. So I really tried. I based my research upon Gilbert and Gannon's excellent book. It's called Case Studies in Forensic Drownings, and built on their kind of general thesis.
And then you whittle, like we said, you whittled that down to about 30 or 40 different victims.
Correct. And I had a much larger list, but those are the ones that came to my attention. And even since the finishing of the documentary in October of 2017, there's probably been another 20 cases or 30 cases. So, it's remarkable. There's these cases happening all over the world, really. There were some in Hamburg, Poland. There was one in Vienna. So, it's remarkable.
Can we go through just a short list of, when you're watching the documentary, it starts becoming very apparent. Well, one, the age range, almost the type of victim, where they're located before they go missing. Can you dive into that a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, the age range is probably is college age. So it's somewhere between 18 or 19. I would say the mean age is 23, 24. But it goes up to 28. There's been some outliers are included in a couple 30-year-old men. But
yeah, but even them, they almost appear younger.
True. Excellent point. Yeah. There's been a couple cases these guys could easily pass for somebody in their 20s. But there's one researcher who has kind of made a spreadsheet, and he came down to the body mass index. All these guys are fit, healthy people. There's almost nobody with a beer belly or overweight or oversized. Right. They're almost all fitting into a very narrow graph of young fit men. So that's a remarkable thing about these cases. Which
is interesting on two levels, because I had a detective look at this and they said, well, one, nobody's oversized, nobody's really tall, nobody's really strong, like brooding men, and nobody's way overweight, so then they would be easier to take control of, but also easier to move the body later.
I mean, and I think it shows this kind of this planning and the selection of some of these men. I believe that they're selected or targeted on the nights that they're out.
Can you dive into that a little bit?
I mean, I think that, when I was researching these cases, and a lot of things that didn't go into the documentary, there were actually a couple near people who survived being drugged.
Really?
Yeah, in the case studies in forensic drownings, they talk about a couple cases of guys who went to the emergency room and had no memory. So there's a current of drugging either through GHB, as Gannon and Gilbertson saw in doses in some of the victims. GHB is gamma hydroxybutyrate. It's endogenous. It's in your system, but in large doses, it incapacitates people. So that's a common trait, and that shows that some of these people are selected in drug.
It's like the date rape drug.
There has been other people have made public statements, and I actually include one case in my documentary about a guy who was drugged in Boston and ended up underneath a road and called the police. He said, "I don't even know how I got here." When he went to court, he said, "Be careful, watch your drink, you can get drugged." So there was another case, and there's other people who talked or who wrote things on Elise Soper's blog and others about meeting strange men who wanted to talk to them and ask them about their background and buy them a drink. And so, there's a lot of suspicious elements there, and there's also a commonality in the more recent cases of some of these young men being on gay dating apps, particularly Joey LaBeaut, Dakota James, out of Pittsburgh. So that's actually fairly close to Columbus, Ohio. I mean, not super close, but it's some people have traced some of these deaths along a freeway corridor. But there was a lot of cases in Pittsburgh. Jimmy Slack, some of these other cases. But both of those young men and others were on gay dating apps, and there's been not just these types of smiley face murder type events, but criminals have used these apps to roll or assault people and take their money. So so as far as the selection process, those apps such as Grindr or these other ones could be used by perpetrators of these crimes as a selection type focus of their victim. And I include in this case a recent case where the inquest is still going on about what happened as a case out of London of a man using gay apps he was multiple names, multiple gay apps to select his victims who he murdered through GHB.
Is it fair to say it seems like the cases that are older to the newer cases, it seems like the percentage of homosexual men being targeted is going up?
Good point. I think that seems to be more overt in these cases. It seems like in the older cases, there were elements to the older cases, particularly in Wisconsin, of kind of gay bars. But some of these newer cases, like Joey LaBeaut, for example, associated with gay bars, Dakota James as well. So, yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah, so Joey actually went missing after leaving the Union, which I don't know if it's actually considered a gay bar or just gay friendly. I know a lot of my friends and other people, we've gone there and drank multiple times. And there was actually a lot of rumors that there was a bartender either there or across the street that eventually got in trouble for drugging. And which I never understood why you would drug one of your customers. And it wasn't like he was doing it to take advantage of anybody.
That's an interesting point. Well, one of the aspects of that case that the public isn't aware of is that the Union also owns the gay bar across the street. So
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so that was one of the aspects that I found out about Joey LaBeaut is there is a correlation between that and he was on his phone. The last text message was a scrambled, jarbled message like GSTION, like possibly. And that's actually not uncommon in a lot of these cases. A lot of these guys send their last texts,
And it could have been in a drug state and you wouldn't know it might have been a cry for help, but you don't know.
Well said, exactly. So
right.
It's very scary, that thing. He didn't know what he was walking into. He was walking into trouble. Probably the same thing with Schaefer, They get lured in there for one reason or another. But yeah, unfortunately, the drugging elements still common. I've heard stories. Even there was a prominent guy who got caught here in Santa Monica at a very nice, well-known establishment. People saw him drug his date, and he got caught. So, those are heterosexual. But so these,
right.
And the interesting thing about these cases, I think that women are very aware of their drink and very aware of the possibility of getting date raped through so many cases, public cases, Cosby, etc. But men don't seem to think that they're targets, and I think that there's this in some of these victims, they don't see it coming, So I think that that's something to get the word out about, is that young men really are in a pool, in a age group that are being stalked or victimized by what's known as the Smiley Face Killers.
Well, and I used to play in bars every weekend, and I used to tell a lot of the listeners, if you lose sight of your drink, toss it. Just get rid of it. It's not worth the $3 to $5, which you don't know what happened. And then the funny thing was, or not a funny thing was, I was playing just an acoustic gig, and I had a gentleman walk into the bar, probably, 30 feet straight to the bar. Didn't say hi to anybody, just went right to the bar, ordered 2 shots for me and for him. Didn't know the guy, brought the shot to the stage, handed me the shot. I said, thanks very much. I put it down, didn't take it. The guy starts yelling, take your shot. I said, no, man, I'll take it later. Take your shot. I go, look, dude, I don't know you. I'm not taking the shot. The dude threw down his shot and took off running. And I just thought, well, what is going on here? And I always wonder, and you probably have some of the similar feeling, is you don't know if by covering any of these cases, if you're going to be targeted by anybody.
I mean, it's interesting when you bring up that shot, because that's how River Phoenix died. Somebody came up behind him and handed him a shot, and that was the hot fix that ended his life. And then he drank it, and he said, what was in that? And it was a massive amount of both speed and heroin. So you got to be careful in that company, And I think he probably felt I didn't put him in the Smiley Face Killers cases, but he was in a bar at night, and that ended his life. So you got to really be careful, and you're lucky to be, in those environments. You can't let your guard down at all.
Right. And I think by you covering this and by other people bringing awareness to these cases, that maybe men will start being a little more wise, as the women have become over the years. Yeah,
there's a couple I included in this as like a exemplar of possible type perpetrators. There was a guy named Lanphier, Lanpher. You can read about him. I included him in my documentary. He was in Wisconsin, but he would go around at night at bars, and people had seen him. One of his victims saw him in a bar playing pool, and he would go around at night and look for men after the bars got out. That was his hunting ground, and it was interesting too, because Lanphier was, I think on the surface he was heterosexual, but he also had the side, and it kind of looks like the Herb Baumeister type thing, where they have a surface. He had a kind of a surface normalcy, but he would abduct them and keep them. And the way he got caught is one of his victims got out, and so it was. I mean, it's terrifying to think that that's what happens, but I think that is an element in all the Smiley Face killing cases, because a lot of these people have disappeared for somewhat significant amount of time. Dakota James was missing for 40 days. And if you watch the documentary, I show conclusively that they searched the area where he was found the day or the weekend before he was found on a Monday morning. So on Sunday night, he magically kind of appeared in the river right there in Pittsburgh. So yeah.
Well, so let's go back to the Joey LaBeaut case for a little bit, because he was missing for 19 days. I don't know if there was ever a report, and I could not find it before we talked, on if they actually searched the Scioto before that day, but I'm assuming at some point they probably did within those 19 days.
I would assume so. And the interesting thing, well, it's kind of graphic, but when people pass away in water, bodies decompose and typically surface just through the process of decomposition. So often in very temperate weather, there's a graph like a doctor had made, but at the very outlier, in super cold, it's like 20 or 25 days. So in normal weather, it's somewhere within a week. So why are these guys not being found within, if they had drowned? And I think I tried to prove, and one of the aspects of my documentary, I think I proved conclusively, is that these are not drownings. They've been called by the FBI drownings. They've been called by other people, random thing, suspicious drownings. But a lot of these people, there have been, I think there was a very lousy surveillance video of Joey LaBeaut, he's upright, you know? He's upright walking around in the short north in the Union. There's other people. Dakota James is walking and typing at the same time, so he's not too drunk. His mom said he was not a heavy drinker. You know, Kelleher out of Boston, upright. All these guys, Garcia out of Boston. Boston is a hot spot. But, you know, these are remarkable that they can call these guys are somehow they can walk upright and then suddenly get incapacitated and drowned in typically very benign, non-high current rivers. Like the Scioto in that area where Joey LaBeaut was found was actually an eddy outside of the main current of the river. So it's highly unlikely that he somehow wandered over there and just, you know, drowned.
Well, and I always wondered, I've never fallen into water while I was drunk, but I would assume that one would almost get a shock to their system and almost sober up a little bit to, you know, swim to the surface, get out of the water. I mean, you're talking about very high levels of intoxication that they would have to be to not be able to just pass out and then just drown. I mean, and I you know, I've played in bars for years. Roughly, you know, rarely would you ever see somebody that intoxicated. You every now and then somebody would be very intoxicated, passing out at the bar. Well, at that point, they have to leave the bar, and normally the bar calls them a taxi or Uber or whatever. So you would think, because bars get in big trouble for that. So you'd think that these individuals being at bars, if they were that intoxicated, that the bar would at least have known something, or we would see that at any time on these surveillance tapes, because most of these tapes that we see of these men, they are, like you said, they're not extremely intoxicated. So let's start with the why. Why do you think these boys are going missing?
I believe they're targeted off. I can tell you that's not happening. There's no financial crimes associated with these guys. There's nothing going on. So why are they abducted? I believe that, and I think I showed
it's okay. It's okay to be graphic too.
Well, I mean, you don't want to get too, but I think that they're a target audience because these are homosexual type associated crimes, and these men fit an ideal: healthy, young, athletic, not fat, and that's what they're targeted for, is primarily sexual purposes.
And then the who
is interested in these type of people. You know, I think that's really if the police want to they have to ascertain that these are not accidental drownings. They have to see that these are dumpings of people who are probably pre-deceased. But once they determine that these are strategic body dumps in water to confuse the cops, then they have to go back and see who's the possible perps, who are the type of people. And I identified a lot of those people in my documentary. You know, I use exemplars. So,
all right. So you say people. So it seems like to me that these detectives early on, when they were talking about the Smiley Face Killer, that it was one killer.
Well, if they were, I think they're making a mistake. I believe that this is a type of learned MO that I think arose into the public consciousness in these events due to the ability of travel and also the ability of communication through international means. So I believe, and my conclusion is that this type of MO has been talked about or discussed through fetish sites or underground dark web stuff. Mm-hmm. And these people have other individuals in different parts of the country and world have put it into practice because they know they can it's kind of like a perfect crime. And even at the time, in some of the early discussions of the cases, you know, when Duarte and Gilbertson were on TV, and there were journalists involved in the cases, there were people who came up and said, "This is the perfect crime. That's why they're dropped in water," you know, and so that's why I think these cases really came to the people's awareness right at the correlation at the time the internet started growing in usage in the 90s, you know. So I think that's where you'd have, and it's remarkable. There's some cases that do not fit the kind of mean, you know, cosmopolitan urban cases. There's a lot in New York, Boston. It says mostly these are urban type cases, but there was one case out of Atlanta, Georgia. Guy's name was Naz Rahimi. He was from Perth, Australia, and he got caught up in the wrong crowd. He was bisexual, hanging out at gay bars, and the Smiley Face Killer type MO happened to him. And it's just that case. I mean, I could tell you stuff offline. It'd blow your mind, man. It's amazing.
Well, no, I want to tell you. I want you to tell me online.
It's just that case. He was found in a river. Some of the investigators on the ground there, Jim Smith, namely, said, some of these guys are really tortured, like literally not just held, but they are tortured. And there were some reports that he looked like he got hit by a car, Naz Rahimi, and that's not conclusive. That's a report, but for example, Patrick McNeil, they call him. He's one of the early Duarte Gannon cases. He was found South Hudson Bay at a water treatment facility, and he was a student at a college in New York City. And they said that he was at a bar, he was leaving, he was puking, a car was following him, watching him. As he stopped, the car stopped. And he disappeared, found dead. And his parents didn't really know much, but after about, I think, 10 years, they got an autopsy. And the autopsy told the parents a completely different story than what they had heard.
So what did they hear?
Well, they had heard that their son was just found in the water and drowned. He was a drowning case or something like that. But
he was drunk, and they probably assumed he was drunk. Yeah.
And the mom is like, we don't know what's going on out there. Well, he when they got the autopsy, the forensics on it showed that looked like he had been bound in a chair, that he had been tortured with a blowtorch on the upper part of his body, that he had like claw marks to his head, like somebody hit him in the head with a hammer, and that was never disclosed, that torture aspect of his abduction. So I do believe a lot of these other cases, these autopsies would tell an incredible story.
So I just want the listener to be very clear on this idea that you believe that at some point there was a killer that kind of came up with this almost kind of like a foolproof plan. I find an individual or I target an individual, I either slip them drug or they're partially drunk, and then this is the type of individual I'm looking for. That I take this person, I torture them or rape them or whatever I do, and then at some point I'm going to drop them into water, and that will help destroy a lot of the evidence.
And confuse the police. So I think that's it. Yeah, that's the Smiley Face Killer MO.
And so then what you're saying is that there's not one Smiley Face Killer, but the idea is that then through chat rooms, through the dark web, through other means, that these killers have almost learned from each other. So there might be a Smiley Face Killer in Chicago or in Columbus, and also there could be 10 of these guys out there working on the same MO, and then so then your theory then also goes into the idea that, so if there was a killer in Columbus, that maybe he went down to Georgia and then did it down there, or went to the UK, or.
And it's interesting, the death of Joey LaBeaut happened during the Arnold Schwarzenegger Classic, right? So how many people came into town for that body lifting?
Well, and if you talk to a lot of detectives, they will even state, there's been the question of, can you get away with murder? And I've talked to a lot of detectives about this, and they always say one of the number one ways to get away with murder would to not have any connection to the victim. And so in this MO, that's why we have hundreds of boys missing. And so it's interesting because you could take your theory a little bit farther. If we have 200 to 300 boys roughly of this type, age, body type, age, that if they're getting kind of a map on how to commit these crimes online, you would assume that if there's 5 to 10 guys doing this similar, that there would be 5 to 10 guys going, I heard your advice, I'm going to do it this way. So, and that could account for the others. So then
well, there are others. There's others that have been found dead. I got to do a list. I think that's really important for me to write a book, because then you can see the totality of the cases and some of the outliers that may not fit the whole water thing, but that were clearly abducted and dumped. But there's amazing. There's just so. I mean, if you watch the whole documentary, there's a lot of people kicked out of bars. That fits in with the whole land fear guy I was talking about. Chris Jenkins out of Minnesota, that's a famous case. Chris Wilcox, Illinois. Zach Marr, Boston. Dakota James, Pittsburgh. Lance James, Bristol. No, Lance James was Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia. Henry Burke, Bristol. Anthony Arena, New York City. So I've got those listed out. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a subculture within that culture that. I mean, if you watch the documentary, I pretty much lay it out pretty clear what I think is happening.
Yeah, so that brings me to a question, because I always knew your work through books and you being an author. So what made you want to take on doing it as a documentary form and not as a book?
There were other books that were out there. And also, I think that through the visual medium, you can see things very clearly that something hyper suspicious is happening. So you can see these cases like Franco Garcia out of Boston, that he's walking upright, that he's not just stumbling drunk, and that they searched the reservoir where he's at. You can watch the search of the reservoir, the cops looking in the reservoir, and then he pops up, some jogger sees him on the side. So the cops who are searching for him with sonar couldn't find him, but some random jogger in the morning can find him, which should tell you something. They didn't find him in the afternoon, right? So they found what happened the night before. The same thing happened with Dakota James and some of these other people, but I think that the visual medium is very helpful in that case. You can see Anthony Arena out of New York, that he's stumbling drunk, and there's literally a car going up a wrong way street trailing him. It's amazing. Like, I don't even know if the cops ever got the license plate of that car or whatever, but Arena was found down the Hudson in Hoboken on the other side of the Manhattan Island where he was last seen. It's an incredible case. So you can see, I think those visual aspects, I do a lot of mapping. There's another case I think that's really important, which is Arvind Sharma. He was a strange case because he was from Nepal. He was a Nepalese, but he was out with friends in South DC and was at a bar that also on the side of it was a gay S&M bar. And he was out, disappeared. His brother says he must have seen something that he shouldn't have seen. Arvind Sharma shows up in the Anacostia River upstream from where he last was seen. So that's even another suspicious case. So when you see all these suspicious cases, one after one after one, I think that the conclusion is something really, very sketchy is happening. But also you can just see it. You can see it on the map.
Do you think it's a 1-to-1 ratio as far as, the attacker and the victim?
I don't know. I really don't. I think there are multiple, like Lanfear was a lone wolf, but, I think that there might be groups. There might be other people helping out and then putting people at ease. Oh, it's just three of us and you, and then that's it. And then at a certain moment, everything turns. There was one case out of Wisconsin. The guy's name was Scott Bake Radel. I think it was one of the drowning in forensics cases, but he was out and got chased by a group of people, and the dad said, and I put it in my documentary when the dad wrote this was incredible. He's flat out says there are groups of people in cars targeting towns, going from town to town, looking for victims every night. So they would go to one town, then the next town, and it fits in the mobility aspect of, I think, that is involved in a lot of these cases.
So then, with these autopsies, with these victims they obviously have injuries other than drowning. Why do you think law enforcement is not doing a better job of putting that out there? Because it seems to me, and some of the cases that we have covered that are connected to this theory, it seems to me that the cops almost want to dismiss and lessen and go, oh, okay, well, chances are he was just drunk. Well, there's no, the toxicology report doesn't, support that. So why do you think they're not, or do you think?
Well, I actually think that almost in all of these cases, the initial opinion, LaBeaut was actually an outlier. I think that the police there in Columbus actually publicly stated, we don't know how he entered the water. But I think a majority of these cases, probably 95% to 99%, the police have immediately looked at them as accidental drownings. I think that they've come upon the body, the guy drowned, and they call somebody, rescue squad, and take them out. They don't look them as crime scenes. And I think that changing that perception of finding a young man in water and looking at it as a potential crime scene would change how people look at these cases. And I talked to an ex-FBI agent. His name was D'Souza, and he had some very fascinating things to say about the Smiley Face Killers. But he said that there's a very significant connection to the authorities and the local businesses not to categorize these as murders, because a lot of these are college students. So a lot of these cases happen in college towns, Boston, and they don't want to raise anything that would besmirch the reputation of the city or the colleges. So that's fascinating. Dakota James was a graduate student. So that, I think, is one important aspect. And I also think that, I don't want to get too much into it. It's interesting because the chief of police in Boston came out and publicly said that there's no suspicious drownings. I think they're you can look through the Boston cases alone. They're highly suspicious. Kelleher and Hurley. And, one of the Kelleher case, who walked out of TDI Garden, he crossed over the St. Charles River, went to Paul Revere Park, called an Uber 3 times, disappeared, but his phone pinged back across the St. Charles River south, all the way into kind of almost like, I think it's the MIT area. How did that happen? That's super suspicious.
To that point as well, you have Joey LaBeaut going missing during one of Columbus's major weekends that they make a lot of money by having this Arnold Classic, and then also these Boston Celtics games or these hockey games that these gentlemen are leaving from. And but you would think that these victims' lives would be more important than tarnishing the idea that you could go to a hockey game and something bad could happen to you if you're not careful.
I would agree.
But now, what about the cases where there is clearly, attack marks on these victims and different? What do you make of that? Is that just shoddy work, or do you think it's just, or is it a larger cover up on some level?
Well, that's a good question. I think that, like Tommy Booth, that was outside of Philadelphia, he was found in a place that had been previously searched, in a very obvious place, 8 days after he disappeared. And he had evidence of torture. I think he had a broken tooth. Somebody put a cigarette out on him. So I don't know why the police aren't disclosed. I think it might be an aspect of police work where they keep certain information from the public. Unfortunately, they're not warning the public, which I think would be important, So I think it's very odd. It's just I can see a clear pattern. I've looked at these cases. I've studied them. I'm not exaggerating when I say the number 150 all over the world. I guess it's just not the police's job to warn the public that this could happen. And like I said, if they're not considering these to be crime scenes, then their work is done right away. Some people have actually speculated it's a lot easier for the police to take somebody off their books by just saying accidental drowning. That's not on my caseload. Yeah, move on.
Yeah, and in some of these towns, you would think, maybe more so a Boston than a Columbus, but these major cities where the crime rate is higher and there would be more caseload. So maybe that's part of the teachings during the dark web and these chat rooms is do this in bigger cities instead of smaller towns where the law enforcement, because if this happened in my town, which is south of Columbus, they would not rest until it was solved.
That's interesting. Yeah, and that may be it. That may be the urban-rural dynamic, is that these are all urban areas, and things happen. Next, move on to the next one. New York, 20 or 30 deaths that have happened there and all found in the water is a pittance compared to the population, right? Yeah,
right.
So it's a very interesting dynamic, but these events are happening. There was one right recently just out of Illinois. There's another out of Manchester within the last month, so
have you ever thought about making this like a podcast series where you could go through all the individual cases?
That's a good idea.
And then as the new ones come out, you could say, well, I think this fits into my theory, or this doesn't fit into my
They
theory.
all fit into the same MO. This guy's name was Kyle Rogers, outside of Chicago, and disappeared, gay, found in a river. So. And the interesting thing is, my documentary, I actually spent about a half an hour talking about the occult nature of the smiley face. That's how really I got started, was seeing the smiley face associated with Alan Moore, acid music, some of these occultists. So there is this element of these crimes that is occult in nature. And if you're really, very aware and just kind of watching, you'll see the smiley face pop up in very strange places. It's like it's popped up in the new It. They use the smiley face. So the symbolism of the smiley face is associated with some of these cases, no doubt.
Now, but that's a smaller percentage in the cases you find than what the detectives initially.
Yes, that definitely found recent smiley faces. Zach Marr, was out of Boston. There was this guy Wilkins out of Bristol. There was a smiley face of a man behind bars, which is remarkable, right down the path where he was last seen. Wilkins was another case that I followed, a more recent case within the last 2 years, that you can see him walking on surveillance video. And the cops came out with the underwater scuba divers to look for his body in a very small pond. Spent the time looking for him, and then he showed up later in that same pond. So it's pretty clear. Yeah.
And then you kind of wonder too if these individuals are also watching the media, and because if they have this individual, and it would be interesting based on autopsy, they would be able to, if it was done correctly, we'd be able to see that this person was alive for 14 days of the 19 days they went missing, and then when were they dumped, and but like we were kind of saying before, it's like, what if this guy's watching the news and finds out, well, they just went through the Scioto River, so now I'm going to dump Joey there. That's now where I'm going to dump him.
Terrifying thought, but it's not uncommon for serial killers or people to ingratiate themselves with police forces or watch the news to see what's going on or taunt police. So, it's plausible.
Well, I appreciate talking with you. I don't know if you have something else that you want to toss in.
I can say that if you want to watch the film, it's available on Vimeo. All you have to do, you can stream anywhere in the world. Vimeo.com. Look up Smiley Face or my name, William Ramsey. It's a very long documentary. I really did try to document operative word. A lot of these cases I include a lot of subtitles so people can read along, and you can reference a lot of the information that I put in the documentary to cases or web sleuths or things like that, and check and verify all those facts. I've never had any of the facts questioned or anything. People have looked through the case, but I've had a very positive response, and you can look at the comments on my Vimeo page to just see all the comments. I mean, you and I talked about Naz Rahimi, one of his family members or friends of him from Perth, Australia, was able to see the documentary and comment that his family didn't believe the story. So, I think that is a very valuable thing, so people can be aware of this. Since I made the documentary, or was working on making the documentary, I found out in Perth, in the harbor of Perth alone, there's been 80 cases of men found in the harbor. So I haven't even gone and looked through that. And I also found out same thing happens in Amsterdam. So this is really a global event. And a lot of these guys, they just had a recent case out of UK, Liam Colgan. It's just incredible to watch these people disappear and then be found in water. Liam Colgan travels, I think he was in Hamburg, and I'm watching it and I go, man, they need to look at the river. And then, 3 weeks later, he's found in the river. So then they just had another kid, Sims, leave a bar in, he was in Scotland, somewhere by St. Andrews Golf Course. They looked all over the golf course. They just found his remains in the ocean. So, that was another one. There's another case of a guy from Laughing Rabbit, or he's the head of a band. He was found in Scotland as well. So these are cases that are just happening over and over again. Same MO, even to this day.
And I don't know much about the dark web, but you would think that FBI and CIA needs to take this stuff a little more serious, and then maybe, because there could be a hub somewhere. I mean, for all we know, there is, training videos, you know?
Good point. Well, I show that if you reach the end of the documentary, I cover a movie that was, I don't want to name the name, a movie that was on Netflix where they are showing water torture. Young man, some older dude just shoving him in water and torturing the daylights out of him. It's incredible. So, something associated with that. And I mean, if you want to get into the fetish world and the people involved in that fetish world, it gets really dark. And, these guys have tastes and interests that shock them on, what they're up to.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you followed the Bruce MacArthur case.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is very similar. There's a lot of similarities. The only difference was he wasn't dumping. He was not taking his victims and putting them in water. He was putting them in flower beds.
Right. Well said. Do you know how they busted him and what happened around his arrest?
Yeah. Well, we covered the case, but
they had he had somebody tied down in a bed. He had somebody abducted, restrained, and in a bed. I think it was a young man. So he had a potential next victim in his place. So
well, and if you get a chance, he had another victim that got away.
Right, I remember that guy. He was interviewed, right?
Yeah. And that's just
that was some dark stuff. And then you just wonder, is it just, are they just getting the information from reading it online, or is it even something darker, like you said, where there's somebody teaching their ways?
Well, there's some really dark stuff in the BDSM, fet life stuff. But, some of these guys, they take on this, and you can read some of these cases, but there's a dominant and a submission. And some of these guys have strange names and roles where they're supposedly like teacher torturers. It's crazy. So, it's potential that these guys, when I was researching this cases, I knew that, I come to the conclusion it was something going on like that, this kind of bondage. Well, here in LA, there are 10 bondage places that you can rent, that you as a public can pay money for a couple hours, and it's
how much do they cost?
I didn't find out.
No,
I was like, hey man, this is like 20 blocks away from me. They're not far, and I would assume that in a lot of these cities, there are places like that. They're literal. Yeah, it's bad, dude. There was one case that you covered on True Crime Garage. It was a guy who, his choice of victim were females, right? But he was an older dude, 57, who literally had like a freaking dungeon on his property, right?
I think that was Worley. And
he was abducting women. One girl was out on a jog or on a ride or bike ride or something like that, and that was one that got away. But, who knows how many people he was. I think that when they catch somebody associated with these murders, they're going to find that the number is big, They're going to find somebody who's a repeat, like a Herb Baumeister. So I would definitely warn the audience. There are definitely
that craze was crazy.
Yeah, crazy. Herb Baumeister was crazy.
Well, Worley up in northern Ohio was crazy too, because I used to play up there, and so I was taking a trip about a couple weeks ago, and then I just Googled while I was in the area, I'll just Google where that was at. Well, it was basically on the way to where I'd normally go anyways, and I probably took that road 20, 30 times, and you just go, here's this guy that has this lair in his barn, and nobody knew about it.
There's a lot. If you look at some of these cases of abductions, there's a lot. These stories of dungeons and stuff, people's personal dungeons they're out there. These people and so they're prime for victims. Weird though. They're looking for victims.
And one of the great things about this documentary is you can buy it or you can rent it. So I think that's a great option.
Yeah, I think it's fair. $5 for a week or $12 you can buy it.
I'm halfway through. I'm very entertained. Can you explain to everybody where they can find you and the rest of your work? Because this is not the first time that you have done tons of research and brought great content to the world.
Well, I appreciate it. My website is William Ramsey Investigates. If you want signed copies or you want to buy a DVD, you can go to WilliamRamseyInvestigates.com. I'm on Twitter, Facebook. I have a YouTube channel, William Ramsey Investigates, where I will post this interview. But I also have a show that goes out on Spreaker, so I'm on iTunes and everything like that. I put out an hour per week. If you're interested in that, you can go check that out too.
It's very cool stuff. I'm glad to say that I know you, and that and hopefully we get to talk about the West Memphis 3
Anytime,
case very
I'd be
soon.
glad to. Well, I'm glad to know you, and I appreciate you reaching out, and thank you very much for the interview.